everybody, welcome to Friday's lecture, our last lecture on growth. So far we've talked about what is growth, what does it look like historically. Now let's talk sort of about what drives growth, what it looks like on the production possibilities frontier, and maybe why it happens. So let's start with this idea of catch-up. Every economist and every growth theory says that over time, economies should reach their production possibilities frontier and therefore have fast growth rates followed by slow growth rates. The problem is we have not seen that in the marketplace. So we haven't seen that in the world. Many developing countries stay developed, and many developed countries have an advantage over those developing countries. So let's look at it graphically. This graph's not in your book, it's from the Solo model, but I think it's a good visualization of what's at play here, okay? Without getting too technical, right? If you remember, big K is capital, little would be capital per capita. How much machinery, equipment do we have per person in an economy? Little y would be income per capita, right? And so as we get more capital per capita, we tend to have increasing incomes, higher incomes. But then at some point, right, there's this saturation level, there's diminishing returns to capital. And that makes sense. You could imagine a giant sewing factory where there's a bunch of people with needles and threads. That's the only capital they have. And then you buy one sewing machine and productivity of one worker shoots through the roof. But if there's 100 workers there, it wouldn't make sense to buy 200 sewing machines. Right? So as you add capital, yes, the group gets more productive, but it's not a linear relationship. Right? It's increasing at a decreasing rate. What we find is capital accumulation is the key, one of the keys to economic growth. And that comes from investment and government spending. So we'll talk about that. But the idea that countries catch up is interesting, right? America has a high level of capital per capita. So we are at a high income, but as we add more capital per capita, we don't experience a crazy growth rate. Good growth for us is 2 to 3%. Whereas good growth in China is 8 to 12%. And what's the difference there? China has 4 times as many people as us, right? Their mix, even if the exact same number of capital as us, they'd have 1/4 the capital per capita because they have 4 times as many people. So they'd be over here. So as they add a little bit more capital, they see a big change in income per capita, where we see a small change in income per capita. So over time, developing economies should experience high growth rates as they add capital, as they accumulate capital through infrastructure spending and private spending by businesses. And so they should eventually catch up. There's, it gets a lot more technical than that, but that's the idea, right? So the further left you are, the more gain you get from a little bit of capital. The further right you are, the more capital per capita you have, the less gain, right? Diminishing returns to capital. Okay? But the truth is, it's not this easy. A lot of countries get stuck in a poverty trap. They get stuck way over here. If you start way over here and you can't figure out how to accumulate capital, you don't grow. There are plenty of countries that look nearly identical economically in 1950 that look completely different today. Similar resource endowment, similar population, similar education levels. Some developed quickly, some did not. Trying to understand why has a lot to do with politics and institutions. So historically, we thought it was add more machines, get more growth. Have technological advancement, get more growth. Add more people, get more growth. Right? More resources means more income. But if you cannot coordinate those resources effectively, you don't get economic development, you don't get growth. And that's, if you recall, we talked about the growth story of mankind, of civilization. It was super flat for thousands of years, and that's because we had a poor way to organize land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship didn't make sense. You didn't own the product of your labor. So it didn't make sense to innovate how to do more with less. Once we had the institution of property rights, right, we had that hockey stick graph. So what are the sort of things that we've observed in successful or developed economies versus underdeveloped or developing economies? Well, the literature is now pointing a lot to institutions. And it should have been obvious from the beginning, right? So let's talk about those institutions. So we've already talked a little bit about property rights, right? When we talked about the growth story, property rights and the enforcement of them, right? The legal system, that institution is the number one determinant of economic growth when it comes to the institution section, right? If a business owner can't keep the profit they make, right? If it can easily be stolen from them by a warlord or the government or their neighbor, some bully, then they're not going to employ a bunch of resources and their own savings and money and time to try and make a profit. Foreign investors are not going to build factories in a country where those factories could be taken over by the government or the mafia or terrorists, right? So if the legal system and property rights don't work, the economy doesn't work. What else? A financial system, right? So you need a functioning currency, you need a way to exchange it, you need a clear ownership of companies, right? That's through the property rights system. And so if you don't have a robust financial system, then it's really difficult to engage in commerce and grow. So you need good banking laws, banking availability, and in the West we've done this with big, large banks. But in Africa, everyone has these little cell phones and they do all their banking there. You can transfer money straight from your little phone. There's a lot of what's called microfinance, incredibly interesting, where you give these tiny little loans for a family or a village to buy some capital. Maybe it's a water filtration system for $1,000, or a new ox for $1,000, and over time they pay off these microloans and they grow the productivity of their small communities. And then they give microloans. So it doesn't have to be big finance, it just has to be a functioning financial system. Education. Right? We talked about the positive externality of education already, but without literacy and numeracy, the understanding of numbers, an economy can't function. Right? You guys are spending gobs of your time and gobs of your money trying to add to your human capital so you can be more productive. Productivity creates growth. Education creates a productive population. So without a functioning, healthy education system, you get low productivity. Maybe that's why productivity is leveled off here in the United States in the last decade. Maybe the value of a college education has gone down and K through 12 education has gone down. You need a competitive market. We've talked about this, we've beaten this horse a lot, but right, if you have to be able to decide what you make, what you buy, where you're going to do it, and how, because that's how you get efficient allocation of resources, right? You get allocative and productive efficiency through markets. You need to be able to engage in trade. You need to be able to access foreign buyers, and you need to be able to buy goods from foreign sellers that you can't produce domestically or can't produce as quickly or as cheaply domestically. And you need a good healthcare system. This one wasn't in the book, but you could imagine that if large swaths of your population are experiencing complications of malaria, it's hard for them to work. Anytime you've tried to do an assignment or take a test when you have a cold, it's hard. You're not nearly as productive. So a good healthcare system leads to a higher productive labor force, higher productivity in your labor force, more growth. All right? So those are some of the key institutions that affect growth. Right? They help you as you accumulate capital. They let you accumulate capital through your property rights, through your financial system. You can borrow money to buy new factories or build new factories. You can have a well-educated workforce to work in those factories to mix with that capital, because what's education? It's also capital. It's human capital. Okay. So this graphic, like I said, it's from the solo growth model. You don't need to know it. It's not in your book, but it's a great framework to sort of see this picture. Right? So America is the leader country. We're already on this edge of this graph. There's a bunch of follower countries trying to catch up. And if they can establish good institutions, they'll have a curve that looks like that. If they can't, they get stuck over here by the origin in what's called a poverty trap. Okay. So remember, this equation, y equals c plus ig plus g plus xn, right? Output equals consumption, gross investment, government expenditures, and net exports. That's important, right? Because changes in these create changes in this. This going up, that's called growth. So what are some of the things that can change these? Let's talk about the supply side, right? The supply factors that can lead to economic growth or stifle economic growth, lead to a recession. Okay. So the supply and quantity of natural resources, right? The endowment, the how much you start with and how the quality changes over time, the discovery of new resources. Maybe taking over your neighbor to the north and exploiting their resources like we did on our midterm. So finding, creating, fostering the discovery and refinement of your natural resources is a way to increase growth. Right? If we discovered a bunch of rare earth minerals here in the United States, it would help in the production of all the electronics we use. The camera recording this lecture, the laptop you're watching it on. It would break the monopoly held mostly by China. So discovering new natural resources, educating your population, having a population boom. All of those things lead to a higher quantity, and if you can increase the quality, great, you will grow. What does that look like? What does that growth look like? Okay? Let's take the production possibilities frontier, the PPF or PPC in your book. We've got capital goods, we've got consumer goods, right? And we've got different mixes. If we use all our resources, let's say this is the USA. If the US uses all of its land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, it'll end up somewhere